wanted to talk about in this video here is amino acid metabolism or protein metabolism, because there's a lot of fear around consuming protein and whether or not that's actually going to be harmful for our body. And so I wanted to just talk about the actual process that's going on here so we can figure out, is this justified and are there nuances? So first of all, in order to understand this, we really need to have a little bit of a brief understanding of what's going on when we are doing protein or amino acid metabolism. Now, bear in mind, this is going on constantly in the body. So let's just use an example here. Okay, so what's happening is, and we can do this with all the amino acids essentially, but I'm going to use a particular amino acid, and in this case, I'm going to pretend that it's actually alanine. So you might have heard of alanine before, or you might have heard of ALT as a liver enzyme. And sometimes this will be raised when you have inflammation going on in the liver. But essentially, we're going to take alanine, and what we're going to do is we are going to spit off its nitrogen group and hand it over to another molecule, which is part of the Krebs cycle, called alpha-ketoglutarate. And at the same time, alpha-ketoglutarate is going to donate this group here to the alanine. So essentially, they're just swapping these highlighted units. From that, we end up getting two new products. So the alanine will get converted into something called pyruvate, which I'm sure you've heard about, and that pyruvate can then be used to make energy in the Krebs cycle. And we can also create this thing called glutamate. Now, what happens with glutamate then is it can then go through a process in which we will use NADP plus, and we'll convert that NADP plus into NADPH, converting the glutamate back into alpha-ketoglutarate. Now, the first concern people have here is that when we do this process to convert the glutamate back into alpha-ketoglutarate, and be able to put that back into the Krebs cycle, we end up spitting off something called NH3, which again is what we had here. Now, the NH3 isn't really a huge problem, but what can happen is that it will be converted to something called NH4+. Now, this is the thing we get concerned about. So the first reason people get concerned about the NH4+ production, and I will just reiterate that every time we are doing this, transfer process, which is constantly happening when we are metabolizing amino acids, is we get this NH4+. Now, what happens with this NH4+ is there are very special cells in our brain called astrocytes. Now, the astrocytes have a special enzyme in them called glutamine synthetase. And what will happen is when we have glutamate, which I said will be produced constantly in this process, it can, in these astrocytes, take on the NH4+, which if we've been doing this amino acid metabolism, will be, as I said, making this NH4+. Now, if this glutamate in the astrocytes was to take on the NH4+ via this special enzyme that they have, we then form a product called glutamine, which makes sense because the glutamate has taken on the nitrogen component and it's now formed glutamine. Why is this a problem? Well, if the glutamine was to be produced, it's very osmotic, this molecule. So that means that if there's any water around, which there inevitably is in the body because we're made up of about 70% water, this will pull the water towards it. It's a very osmotic molecule. Why is this a problem? Well, it can lead to things called cerebral edema because, again, the astrocytes are in the brain. So if these molecules, the glutamine in the astrocytes, are pulling water towards them, we're obviously going to be pulling water into the brain. And so this can lead to intracranial pressure and eventually, unfortunately, lead to things like coma. So this is the first concern when we are doing a lot of amino acid metabolism. What the body will naturally do is it will try to offset this and try to fix the problem by converting the NH4 into a less concerning product, which is something called urea. So if we move over to this screen, what's happening essentially is that we will take this NH4 and we'll combine it with something called bicarbonate, or actually two bicarbonates. And we'll end up producing this product called carbonyl phosphate. This will then go through this special process called the urea cycle. I'm sure you've heard of that before. So once we've taken this carbonyl phosphate, we'll convert it to citrulline. This citrulline will then get converted to arginine and then to ornithine, and the cycle will just keep going round and round and round. But something that's very important to see here is that once we've made this arginine, in order to convert it to ornithine, we end up spitting off this urea. Now, urea is much less toxic to the body than the NH4+, the ammonia. And so we are then able to excrete this urea in the kidneys. So the kidneys are really special here. Now, as you can imagine, there are concerns here, and the more amino acids that you're actually metabolizing, of course, the more you eat, the more you're actually metabolizing, and then the argument is then the more ammonia you're going to produce, as I said, because you're producing this NH4 and it's osmotic. And then, of course, the more you are, converting that ammonia into carbonyl phosphate, the more you're going through this urea cycle, and then the more urea you're producing, and the more burden that is for the kidney to have to excrete. But let me talk about some nuances here. Now, when else are we actually going to be doing this amino acid metabolism outside of what we are doing when we're just eating protein? We're going to do it when we are doing tissue catabolism or tissue breakdown. So the argument here would be, if you are doing excessive amounts of tissue breakdown, so for example, you are in a catabolic state and your tissues are getting broken down excessively, you're going to end up with more of these products that could lead to, excessive ammonia production and the need to excrete more urea. You'd also have problems if there is issues with your kidney health. So if, for example, your GFR is low and your body is not able to utilize those kidneys properly because, say, for example, there is inflammation in the kidneys, and your GFR is low and you're not able to excrete that urea properly, then of course you're going to get this buildup of urea in the body that can't be excreted. So while, yes, there is an argument for the high intake of amino acids via protein, we need to remember that amino acids have so many functions in the body and they're getting utilized all the time. So even if you are not actually consuming a lot of protein, this whole amino acid metabolism is constantly going on anyway. So whether or not you're eating a lot of protein or not, you're doing this amino acid metabolism and you will be getting byproducts from that your body will have to excrete via urea and the ammonia that your body has to deal with anyway. My argument again would be, if your body is going through issues in which it is breaking down tissue, like for example, you are in a catabolic state, like let's say you have an inability to utilize your insulin properly and utilize your glucose, so you're catabolic, then of course you are going to be making more urea. And then the last thing is, if your kidneys are going through some kind of stressor, like for example, they are inflamed, which they tend to be, and I see this all the time with people that have, raging inflammation going on in their body, their kidneys are one of the first organs to suffer, and then they end up getting a buildup of urea in their blood because their kidneys aren't able to excrete it. So anyway, look, if you have any more questions about this, I hope this makes sense. But just to reiterate, we are doing this amino acid metabolism constantly anyway. While if you're excessively eating protein, of course, you can, go through this amino acid metabolism more. But it's actually more of an issue of excretion and the ability to deal with the byproducts of amino acid metabolism that is more of an issue than actually just consuming protein in the first place.